I am Liz Powell. I'm the founder and head of G2G Consulting, which is a government affairs firm based in DC. And what we like to do is start off with a little bit of our introduction so you get to know us in case you're new to what's happening in Washington, D.C. And then we'll dive into issues that are really interesting right now. Lots to talk about in government and policy, politics, etc. So I'll start off with my little intro. I used to work on Capitol Hill. I was a legislative director for a couple of different members of Congress. I've done a lot of work in health policy, but I also staff the Armed Services Committee, the Small Business Committee. So I've done a lot with entrepreneurs and businesses over the years. And also founded Women's Health Advocates, which has become really active in advocacy for the health of women, spanning the lifespan, head to toe, all kinds of issues. We've been really active in the small business opportunities such as the SBIR program and working hard to get that reauthorized. We can open up those dollars for small businesses. So that's my little intro. And I will pass to my colleague, Chris Cooper, also on the G2G team.
Thanks, Liz. Hi, everyone. My name is Chris Cooper. I am a director in G2G Consulting's Washington, D.C. office. I joined the team about 3 years ago. And before joining G2G, I worked on Capitol Hill like Liz did for about a dozen years, held a number of positions in the two offices I worked in, anything from leading our appropriations work, so how federal money gets spent and what my bosses and our congressional district's priorities were, to chief of staff, where you oversee the staff in both the DC and district offices. So I'm happy to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
And Chris Oates.
Yeah, I'm Chris Oates. First of all, I'm going to move this balloon. Moving around for all of the heating footsteps here.
Very
Get
important
that out of the
balloon.
way.
You have to share why it's so important.
It's a golden number 4 balloon because my son turned 4 recently, and it
Well,
is
that's
now in
great.
that stage where it's
Yeah.
just lingering in the house. But I'm a political risk analyst. I've worked for Oxford Analytica. I've taught courses at the Pentagon, done reports for the European Parliament. I now have a startup which looks to make the policy process more transparent. So if anyone out there uses Politico Pro or Bloomberg Government, it's similar to that. And as of either this afternoon or tomorrow, when a friend of mine says whether or not he'll be my campaign treasurer, I will be a candidate for the Massachusetts House of Representatives from Somerville and Medford. So
Wow. All
yes,
right.
in typical Massachusetts politics fashion, our state senator, who is 82 years old, decided not to run for re-election, which opened up a state Senate seat. So my representative went for the Senate. So I figure I've got to go now because the seat's going to be taken for the next 20 years if I don't. So um, gonna do that soon, but don't worry, I will be not at all, hopefully partisan, and certainly we're not talking about state level politics. So I will be completely objective as much as I can be here today. And then, of course, if anyone does want to donate to my campaign, as soon as I get the Act Blue thing up, you can Google me, and I'm sure you'll find it.
You're going to
But
be a
I
good
don't.
politician.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. You always got to ask, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I talked to someone yesterday about kind of how do you do it, and he said you make a list of everyone you've ever met, and then you ask them for money. And so everyone on this call, even though I can't see you, trust that we now have met. So if you want to give me money, please feel free to do so. But it is not required to listen to this webinar,
Definitely not
thankfully.
required, but that's
Yes.
great. Okay. Well, you'll have some interesting insights then, I think, now that you're a candidate.
Yeah.
So that's great. So let's start from the top. Okay. So there's lots going on. Everything always revolves around money and the budget. We're sort of in a shutdown. What's really going on right now? Chris, we'll start with you, Mr. Appropriations King, all things appropriation. So if you could explain to folks what's really going on with this, how they closed out the rest of the bills, and why we have this shutdown, that would be helpful. And I'd then love to pass to you, Chris Oates.
Sure, happy to talk about that. So Congress, just as a very brief background, there are 12 annual spending bills that Congress needs to pass to fund the vast majority of federal operations. We are currently in the fiscal year 2026 cycle, and for this fiscal year, Congress has passed 11 of those 12 full year spending bills. So the vast majority of federal operations are not impacted by this latest shutdown that you're probably, reading about in the news or hearing about on TV. So things like the Department of Health and Human Services, CDC activities, NIH activities, Department of Defense activities, um, air traffic controllers, all of those things are not subject to the current shutdown, and are not being impacted by this current shutdown that we find ourselves in. The only agencies and components that are being impacted are those found under the Department of Homeland Security Appropriations Bill. So things like the TSA, FEMA, the Coast Guard, and the Secret Service are examples of components that are funded under that particular annual spending bill. So those areas would be impacted by the shutdown that began last week. Um, Impacts so far are rather minimal. The first paycheck, I believe, that those folks would be potentially missing is scheduled for February 27th. So they haven't necessarily missed a paycheck yet. And then also, I believe roughly like 90% of DHS employees are considered essential. So they will continue to operate in their positions, even though there is technically a shutdown. Um, Kind of why we are finding ourselves in this place. So after the events in Minnesota, I guess it's probably been over the last month at this point, congressional Democrats are calling for a number of reforms. I can't remember if there's 10 or 12 of them, but reforms to immigration enforcement. So things like tighter warrant requirements, unmasking agents, and requiring the use of body cameras when interacting with the public are some of the um, things that they're calling for before they'd agree to provide votes for funding the Department of Homeland Security. So, over the past week or two, the White House and Democrats have been trading offers, but there hasn't been too much movement, honestly. I think both sides are kind of entrenched in their positions. So, I don't see a resolution coming very quickly to this situation. Mostly because, again, Democrats especially are feeling pressure from the base not to provide additional funds to ICE and CBP without reforms or at all in some cases. And Republicans aren't feeling as much pressure to agree to those demands because the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, I can't remember all the words in the name, but from last year provided billions of dollars for ICE and CBP, meaning that those agencies can largely continue to operate regardless of the current shutdown that's impacting other um, DHS entities. Um, so we'll see what happens. I don't think anything will happen, at least for a week. Both chambers of Congress are not here this week from the federal holiday on Monday. So at best, I think we'd see something, some movement probably next week or even after that.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because every shutdown is really a question of leverage and which side thinks you have the leverage. Because the idea is that you create a situation that is very uncomfortable, and people look and they say, "Why are the parks shut down? Are there delays? Federal workers are have to go without pay." And then one of the parties that appears to be in the wrong, kind of from public opinion, feels the pressure to compromise and end the shutdown. So 2013, which would probably like the clearest example of that, Senator Ted Cruz encouraged a group of House Republicans to shut down the government to end Obamacare. The Republican approval ratings went pretty far down. I think is like the furthest they had ever been in modern polling. And so Speaker Boehner, before the debt ceiling came up, like ended it because he thought we're getting criticized in the public, basically for nothing. What I think is interesting here is that, as you say, there isn't really much collateral damage. So it's not as if you have a huge pressure to end it by both sides because they think, if the public blames us for that, that's really bad. Last November, it was really, in my opinion, it was the food stamp situation where food stamps payments weren't going out. And people said, this is too much, both on the merits of the situation, but also we don't want to be blamed by the public for saying, like, we are the reason people are missing food stamps. So I think what's interesting here is, like, as you say, it's only one of the 12 bills that is held up. 90% of the people are essential. So other than the fact that those folks may miss paychecks, but they will then get paid back later, there's not like a real public outcry to do something. And then, as you said, Republicans, they don't feel pressure because on ICE and CBP, they can keep the funds going. And for Democrats, it's not like there's really any incentive for them to back down from demands that they, deliberately made to be as reasonable as possible. And I think Schumer and Jeffries, there was a lot of pressure from some in the base to completely, defund ICE. But that's, I mean, not even financially going to happen because they've already been funded. So they created a strategy of we will ask for very basic things that Kristi Noem had already kind of implied were on the way. And they feel like public opinion is on their side. So you don't have a lot of incentives for a compromise, but you also don't have a lot of incentive to compromise in the first place. So that's why I think if I had to guess about where we go with this, I think probably what might happen next week when they come back is that Republicans will agree to some compromises on the actions of CBP, for example, masking and body cams, because they were already kind of hinting at that. And then there will be 8 Democratic senators who will, like last November, will agree to fund the government. They'll be the ones that take the hit, but they're largely the ones who are retiring or are not up for reelection. So that's my guess, but it's one of those weird shutdowns where it's kind of not really a shutdown. So it could theoretically go for like a month or two without anyone other than the people whose paychecks aren't being sent, like really feeling it. So it's a shutdown that's not a shutdown in a sense.
Yeah, and then there's also just one more. There's also a weird dynamic here in this case because both parties, both chambers, again, prior to some of those escalatory events in Minnesota, had agreed to a full spending package, including the Homeland Security bill. And as part of that, Republicans did agree to put additional resources for things like body cameras, which obviously is, again, one of those points that Democrats are calling for. So I think part of the Republican argument right now and why they're not feeling the heat as well is the status quo right now is that we don't have those extra funds and things for body cameras, which is one of the points that you're calling for. And so ICE is operating as they were before any of this stuff happened, again, with billions of dollars. I think at this point, ICE might have more funding than all other federal law enforcement agencies combined. I think I saw that somewhere.
Yeah.
Um, so there's no, as you said, there's no like cliff necessarily that's coming up that would lead both parties to kind of feel that heat.
Yeah.
One thing that I agree to all that you're saying, but one thing that goes through my mind as a fellow, former person on the Hill who had to manage appropriations every year, and knew very well the difference between authorizations and appropriations, as you both do as well, right? So even though it's in the big beautiful bill and it's authorized at this massive number, if the
It's
appropriators
appropriated. No, it's
don't
already
appropriate,
appropriated. No, it's
okay, so
already
that one is
appropriated.
done.
It's
But
mandatory. Yeah.
what about 2027? Could it be
So
blocked
it's
for that?
no, I mean it's
Okay.
it I think they got like $75 billion that they can basically spend for 3 or 4 years. So, and I think
Oh,
their
it's not
annual,
tied to the
yeah,
year. Okay.
right. And I think
Okay.
their annual budget is somewhere around $10 billion. So again, it's like 7 regular years worth of funding is already provided
Okay.
for them to operate.
Oh
So
man, that's insane. I heard a senator at a hearing, I think it was last week, talk about how the funding went from like 8 to 88. So it's like a huge increase for them. So anyway, all right. Well, very interesting
yeah,
how there's a lot of people upset about what's happened, and yet we don't really see a change because the money's already out the door. So whatever, I guess it'll just be rhetoric. Maybe also contributing is the fact that they did remove that presence in Minnesota and Minneapolis. So I think that is helping too to sort of de-escalate all this stuff. But in any case, overall, we're now moving into FY 2027 appropriations. So, Chris, where are we in that process? And we've got the State of the Union coming up. Thoughts on what the president is going to emphasize in this budget, de-emphasize, just any kind of insights. And happy to start with you, Chris Oates, first, if you want to take that one, and then to Chris Cooper.
Well, I'll start with the big picture stuff because I know
Okay.
Chris Cooper knows the details of appropriations better. I think what's really interesting here, in terms of the plan for Congress this year, is like there's not much on the agenda. I mean, they've done appropriations, more or less. I mean, if you asked, I think, if you went into John Thune's office and said, like, what's your big plan for the year? What do you see as the goal? Like, you could look back on December 31st and say, we did a great job legislating this year. I don't know if he would have an answer. Um, there are some things, there is some legislation pending. The Speed Act, which is about permitting reform, is kind of pending in the Senate, but I think that's basically dead because Sheldon Whitehouse does not want Democrats to vote for it as long as there are whole blocks on renewable energy projects. So that's kind of one of those big things that senators can look at and say, we did this and we improved like just the general sense of government. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see them really talking about anything on financial regulations other than maybe there's like some more crypto stuff that they were going to do. They did kind of stable coins. They might do some other stuff, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of anything. Most of it went into the OB3 last year or appropriations. We have a question about SBIR. I think that's something that is still pending that might be addressed. But you don't, it's not like in 2022 where Democrats passed in 2021 the Chips and Science Act and the bipartisan infrastructure framework, and then also the COVID package early in March. And then they were still waiting on all of the social aspects of Build Back Better. And I don't know if you remember those videos that I think the kids would say they're cringe of like Marty Walsh talking about how like childcare is infrastructure because when they split Build Back Better, they still wanted to get everything to be named infrastructure. But there was still a lot of stuff going. There was still a lot of energy up through July and August when the Inflation Reduction Act passed. And you don't see that this time. And I think that's really interesting. So my thought is that whatever the agenda is for this year, it's mostly going to be going through executive orders. And so that's what I'm going to be paying attention to in the State of the Union. What are those executive orders? And is it going to be the case that senators and representatives are basically just holding on through the primary and then pivot as fast as possible to the general to try to not lose their seats?
Yeah, and you mentioned SBIR. I do think that is one issue that should be addressed this year, hopefully relatively soon. It sounds like they're very close to a deal on reauthorizing SBIR. I've read that five of the six, what they call the corners that have sort of jurisdiction over this issue, have signed off on a potential deal. And it sounds like the ball is sort of in Senator Ed Markey's court from Massachusetts. He is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Small Business Committee. So right now, it sounds like the pressure is getting supporters of SBIR and STTR to reach out to his office to get them to agree to the framework or the deal that the other corners have signed off on. My understanding is that some of the largest multiple award winners are opposed to the current deal, so that could be playing into um, any last minute hesitation in approving it. But it sounds like
Is
they
that
are
because
very
there's a
close.
cap, Chris, right? Is because there's some kind of a cap or
Yeah,
something?
it would basically allow each agency to set limits on the number of SBIR proposals that a company could submit. And so those that obviously receive a large number of awards oppose any sort of cap like that. So we're obviously the fact that they haven't signed off and moved on, there's some sort of sway that those groups are having right now. But there's also a large grassroots effort to get these programs reauthorized, given the impact that the expiration is having across the country. So I do think SBIR is one thing that will move, I would say, very quickly once they do all agree. I don't foresee it being stalled much further once those key players agree to the deal. The NDAA, National Defense Authorization Act, is the other sort of main issue I think that will get some movement this year. That's usually toward the end of the year, but Congress has enacted it, I think, every year since the 1960s. So, that will continue. But, things like appropriations, and I can talk about the FY27 cycle, but depending on election outcomes, especially, would likely get kicked to 2027. If Democrats are set to take over the House, they're going to want to wait to negotiate from a stronger position when they would take over the House in 2027. So there's just a lot of dynamics that make it more likely that that will be kicked to 2027. So as far as the State of the Union next week, I think it's on the 24th. I would expect the president to focus on areas that they feel they are in a better position to speak on, things like crime, border security, national defense, things like that. Um, we've increasingly seen over the last few years State of the Unions become a way for members of Congress to sort of express their approval and disapproval with what's being said. So I know last year some of the Democrats in attendance, they left early or they held up different signs or wore, specific outfits. I think it was Al Green from Texas, a representative from Texas, interrupted the president's speech early on. He actually was censured by the House after he did that. I don't know if it will go that far this year. Usually the minority party leadership will sort of advise their members, don't do something like that, like either plan not to attend or find other ways to kind of express your opposition to what's happening. Both Jeffries, I've heard, has given that message to Democrats for next week. Mike Johnson and other Republican speakers gave the same message to their members when they had certain folks do outbursts during the Biden and Obama administration. So it'll be interesting to see how the dynamics are in the room. Also, we just talked about DHS funding. It's likely that DHS will still be shut down when he gives the State of the Union next week. So, that could play a role in sort of what's discussed and how members are reacting. So that's what I'm looking at the State of the Union. And then as far as FY27 appropriations, we're at the very early stages of that process. Some offices are beginning to release their individual request forms that organizations and groups have to fill out to list their priorities. We're expecting House and Senate appropriations committees to release their guidance within the next couple of weeks, which really sets the time frame that offices have to submit their priorities. And then obviously the president's budget should come out within the next few weeks, which will also kick off committee activity, holding hearings with administration officials like secretaries of the different departments to testify on the budget proposal for the year. So that's all coming and really sort of ramping up within the next few weeks.
Yeah, so we're hearing either March 10th or 17th are the two dates that is in the rumor mill of when the president will send out his budget. And traditionally, the Approps Committee doesn't like to set their deadlines until that budget comes out. So there's sort of a bit of a wait for that. So really interesting to have that overview and how you pointed out the elections will really determine when they finish that appropriations process, when those top lines are really, determined, because they may set top lines now, but they could totally change based on what happens with the elections in November. So I think that's all really fascinating. So clearly elections are definitely on people's minds. So what do you think is top of mind for the president, the speaker, minority leader, Schumer, Jeffries, et cetera? Like, what do you think is front of mind for them that they're most concerned about wanting to push or block right now, as we head into this, what will be midterm elections, the appropriations process, et cetera. So, um, do you want to go, Chris Oates, since you're more
Sure.
the political risk guy?
Sure. I think what's interesting is how uninterested Thune and Johnson seem to be about the elections. I mean, because clearly what you should be doing at this point, if you are the party trailing in the polls, and they're not trailing so badly in the generic ballot, but the president's approval rating is really low down. Um, what you should be doing is trying to set up your members for success. So you hold a bunch of votes on things that make the other party look bad or divides them, or you give your own party members kind of uh, a free vote to go against you. But they don't really have the numbers for that. So, for example, Mike Johnson, when he passed OB3, what in an ideal world for Republicans, they would have been like Democrats in 2010, where Pelosi could let, I think it was about a dozen Democrats in the House vote against Obamacare so that they can go to their districts in the midterm and say, I didn't vote for Obamacare. I know it's unpopular. But he didn't have the ability to do that. So you see representatives like Mike Lawler in New York who took very unpopular votes that will make it hard for them. So I think there's not much they can do legislatively. I mean, you can hope that the economy does much better. You can hope that the revisions to job growth for 2025 don't continue, and that we see a lot of productivity gains from AI or whatever. But there's not a lot that they can do now because they don't have the freedom to do that. And it's not like you can give a lot of stuff to swing state members if that would alienate them with primary voters. So I think they can't do a lot. For Jeffries and Schumer, the difficulty is going to be really from the outside. How do they encourage Democratic voters to not dislike the party so much? Because that's one of the reasons why Democrat approval ratings went down dramatically at the start of last year. It wasn't necessarily that like independents turned on them, it was that Democratic voters turned on their own party because they were upset with leadership. Um, that matters because, especially for the Senate, Schumer is really hoping that more electable candidates win primaries. It's one reason why he was so adamant to recruit Janet Mills in Maine, because she thought she's a two-term governor. She was the more electable choice. They're all really pulling for James Tallarico in Texas, even if they won't admit it. And in Iowa, there's a few different candidates that I think they're not overly split on, but I think there's one that the party really wants. So that I think is really what they're trying to do is how to help those candidates win elections and then how to set up the party overall, which is mostly navigating, as Chris Cooper said, how do you balance the fact that the base voters tend to want more confrontational actions in Congress versus the reality that they don't actually have much power. And especially with no big votes coming up, they can't do much. So I think what's you're likely to see is like Schumer and 8 other Democrats will take hits when they need to allow Janet Mills and Haley Stevens and James Tallarico to say, oh, I don't like what's going on in Washington and position themselves more a bit of an outsider. So it's not to be completely cynical about all of it, but I think that's the reality of how they're trying to navigate. Whereas I think with Thune and Johnson, they really, I mean, don't have a lot of power other than like directing funding resources.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean that so just to give some context, the House is currently there's 218 Republicans and 214 Democrats with 3 vacancies. So that's basically a one vote majority. And as Chris said, gives Speaker Johnson virtually no ability to move big ideas right now because you have the more moderate members that are very concerned about their prospects in the upcoming elections, combined with members of the party that are being redistricted out as part of the ongoing battle between the parties nationally to redistrict mid-decade. And then you've got, the more far right, similar to the base that he described on the Democrat side, that want them to continue to push everything they can in a very conservative way while they have control of both chambers of Congress and the White House. Um, and so, as far as what I think are Speaker Johnson versus Minority Leader Jeffries' priorities, I think they're complete opposites. Jeffries is going to look for ways that they can get a few of typically those more moderate Republicans to join them to force votes on things that the White House and that the majority party at large do not want. A couple recent examples of that. the I think it was a week or two ago, a handful of Republicans in the House joined Democrats to push back on Trump's tariffs on Canada. Earlier in January, a number of House Republicans joined Democrats to pass a 3-year extension of the temporary enhanced ACA tax credits that expired at the end of the year. So I think Johnson's priority will be to continue to try to find those areas that they can use their limited power to pressure some House Republicans to join them in those types of votes. And again, I think Johnson's goal is the opposite of trying to keep the party unified so that those types of um, Democrat pushed issues are not able to make it to the House floor and put certain members of the party in a tough position. So, which then he also gets angry calls from the White House about,
Yeah.
why did this happen? Because again, they're pushing back on certain administration priorities, especially in the tariffs. So,
Yeah. You know what's interesting though, Chris, is that by Jeffries doing that, he's kind of helping those moderates now have something to run on if they're in that district that is a really tricky district. They can say, oh, well, I voted with the Democrats on this bill. So it's interesting how that could be played either way. But um, yeah.
I'll chime in on that. I know
Yeah.
we're talking about these like moderates. I think this is one of those things that Washington gets wrong because if you look at the political science research over the last 10 years, voting has become much more partisan and polarized. You see a lot less split ticket voting. Senate, you can because senators are more individual, but in the House, it's almost like a one-to-one correlation. So I think this is one of those things where if you're Mike Lawler and you're a moderate Republican, you think you're special and you think people like you as an individual. And I think that's because you are, an individual and you're living your own life and you're interacting with people who like flatter you all day because they're trying to lobby you. Not that you would flatter people unnecessarily, but others do. But I think this is one of those things where the logic of a lot of moderates on Washington, D.C. is like, I'm going to protect my individual seat by doing this. And I think that's really limited. So I think what Jeffries knows is that anything that is bad for Trump is bad for swing seat Republicans. And so I think it's interesting because it's almost like a different political science approach to how elections work between those who are in the elections and those who are running it, which is also what you see when you're trying to get people to say like we need to do this because it's good for the party and so often they don't do it because they're like well my district doesn't like it. It's like well you're going to lose your seat anyway, so you might as well just do it. So I think that's a really interesting disconnect. We might see that start to expand over the course of this year.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to point out, so Trump has raised a ton of money. Since 2024 alone, he's raised $1.5 billion with his various PACs and different entities. And which is just very rare for an incumbent president who can't run again to be raising money like that. It's like the guy is just unstoppable in his fundraising. And it seems like he is gearing up to fund those who fall in line and make sure that those who don't get a dime and even get money spent against them. So thoughts on the president in particular and how he sees his role in these elections in politics. Would love to hear your thoughts on that. Either one of you can jump in.
yeah, I mean, yeah, I
Yeah.
was gonna, yeah, I'll go. I was gonna say, I mean, both on the fundraising side, but also just his endorsement is still king within the Republican Party, and we're seeing that in, I think the Louisiana Senate race is probably the best example of that, where in January you had a relatively new representative named Julia Letlow from Louisiana announce that she's going to challenge the incumbent Republican Senator Bill Cassidy shortly after President Trump said that he'd endorse her if she chose to run. So, um, once you are kind of on his, you're not 100% with me list, you're opening yourself up to that type of attack from the president. And Cassidy was one of 7 Republicans that voted um, to convict the president in the impeachment trial pertaining to the January 6 events. And so obviously the president has sort of held that against him since that happened. And four of those seven are no longer in the Senate. And Susan Collins is going to face a tough competitive race later this year that Chris mentioned with against the governor of Maine. So I mean, they're walking a fine line in trying to highlight areas that they differ from the president, especially if his approval ratings aren't as great as they would like in the district, in the state, what have you. But at the same time, if you sort of are out on the limb, he will knock you down. And when push comes to shove, the Republican base is going to go with the president over their senator, their member of Congress, what have you. So,
Yeah, and I think there's two things as you mentioned, Liz and Chris. I think there is the endorsement, which matters because that is political support to one person or another. And I think the endorsement certainly matters this year. We expect that it could matter in 2028, although I think that that's going to start to decay because I think when the presidential primaries start to ramp up, people will have a lot more exposure to the different candidates than they might in a Senate primary, where it's like, are you the candidate pro-Trump or anti-Trump? And that's kind of all I need to know because I'm someone who just has a 30 seconds to like think about my Senate race. Certainly in House races as well, like logos really matter on that mailer. And if you can send a postcard to voters, say like endorsed by President Trump, that matters. Presidential primaries, I don't think they will. And then there's the question for 2028. Does that mean that if his endorsement decays for the presidential, it starts to decay for senators and representatives? I don't know about that, but that would mean that, his influence within the party would erode over the next legislative session because people looking to the reelection would think, well, I don't have to worry about the president thinks about me because, what will matter more is like whether the next nominee endorses me and whether I'm good with them. The money is the other thing, though. And this is something you're right, we haven't seen. And I mean, it is an extraordinary coincidence that so many people who have business before the federal government are donating to these various non-governmental things that the president controls, like this, or the East Wing Ballroom, or a documentary about a first lady. I mean, what a coincidence! But what that means is that he has a lot of money to spend, and that money doesn't go away. And so it could be that the endorsement decays, but him or the people who are controlling the money, because I think what we can see already is his health is declining. Maybe it's declining in the normal way that it declines for a 79-year-old, but it means that for 2028, he may not be there for this kind of stuff. And so the question is then who takes it over? We don't know that yet, but it may mean that, either Don Jr. or Eric or Jared Kushner or I don't know, insert kind of Republican figure close to Donald Trump here has control of $1 billion to play in primaries. And I think that's the thing that really, to me, stands out is it's not like he's saying, I'm going to use this in the 2028 general election, or I'm going to help Greg Abbott defend his Texas seat. It seems to be much more explicitly to be in primaries than you ever have seen in like kind of party controlled PACs. Very, rarely like the Senate majority leader will have a PAC that supports an incumbent against a challenger. But generally speaking, it's either we stay out of primaries or we just support incumbents across the board. This is, I think, a really interesting one. And it's one of those things like Chekhov's gun that's like in the background, you read in a newspaper in like early 2025, and you're like, huh, that's interesting. And 3.5 years later, it might really start to be important.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think that they are raising money like crazy under Donald Trump's name, his image, everything, because he has this force, this incredible ability to fundraise, knowing that he is aging and the day is going to come where he can't do that. So, but his sons and that team, whatever, they'll then manage the money and be able to influence politics for decades. Like, so I feel like there is definitely a plan to raise as many billions as possible so that they can forever, at least a very long time, have this influence and control over the party. So it's fascinating. It'll be really interesting to see, down the road, 5, 10 years from now, where's the Trump family when it comes to politics and government. So anyway, we can get back to politics in a bit. I also wanted to talk about there's been some issues that we kind of danced around. We talked about a little bit, but one is the big issue that really caused the shutdown in the fall was the extension of the ACA subsidies. And we've all seen our health insurance rates go up, and now there are people who are not on health insurance. So where are we with that issue? And what do you think is going to happen? Is that going to get resolved, or is that just an election issue? Like, what do we think about this whole ACA health subsidies issue? And I'd love to have Chris Cooper start.
Sure, and I did mention in one of my previous responses this as an example where um, the Democrats were able to get a few House Republicans to go along, but in early January, the House did pass a extension for, I believe it was 3 years of those ACA enhanced premium tax credits. Senate Democrats tried to pass it by unanimous consent on the Senate floor shortly after the House passed it. But any senator can object to that, and Senate Republicans did block it. So right now, from my perspective, um, there was also, I guess, separately some bipartisan negotiations that Senator Bernie Moreno from Ohio was part of, that had, to extend the credits with some other reforms included as part of that deal. That negotiation has slowed, and so it remains unclear if any sort of consensus will be found. I think it's less likely that a deal is reached as more time passes and attention spans start to jump to other issues. Again, we've been talking about immigration the past month or two, the way we were talking about this issue in the fall. So I think it will continue to be, in line with the affordability at large, an issue that um, particularly Democrats, but that folks are wanting to speak about heading into the elections in the fall. And I don't think it will get resolved, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I agree. I see Democrats having had their chance. They took their shot. They got the votes. There weren't the votes in the Senate. And I think, yeah, there's negotiations, but I don't think anyone in the Democratic Party really thinks that this is going to happen. Um, Pretty clear this is just a difference of opinion about what the best policy should be, and it's hard to have any leverage. I think the other thing, though, to mention with on health is that the OB3 One Big Beautiful Bill had a lot of cuts to Medicaid, and that really matters for states because a lot of like Medicaid is a program that is both federal funds and state funds. It's mostly administered by states. So as budget seasons come up in most of the state legislatures, many of them have fiscal years ending in June or July, and they're looking to the next year. A lot of conversations are about what is the impact of lower federal reimbursement or lower federal funds going to state legislatures going to be. So that's something that you're going to see. Again, maybe not at the federal level this year, but going into the future about do Medicaid rates go back up again via federal funds? Because most members of Congress are hearing from their state legislators and governors, we're losing these kinds of funds, and now I need to cut teachers or road spending or whatever else the states have as their priorities because they have to fill that gap from the federal government, or they just have to have lower enrollment in Medicaid at their state. So it's one of those things that it comes from the federal government, but you're not going to see it there. You're going to see it manifested in what your governor or state legislator does.
Yep, which all fits into, as Chris was saying, the affordability issue. I think that is how folks are going to be campaigning. The other interesting thing with Medicaid is that the cuts don't happen until the end of the year. So while there's been some efforts, and the new rural healthcare fund applications already went in for that. So the real pain, might not be felt until after the election. So I think that if the Democrats are using that as their issue, they've got to really make sure that connects with voters, so that connects with how they vote if they're going to make that the issue. But yeah, so really interesting there. We always have some comments on the economy, tax policy, tax issues. I know they always do these extenders when they are wrapping up the final appropriations bill. They also tack those on. So like telemedicine, which is hugely popular for remote care, that got included. I don't know, Chris, if you wanted to add any other thoughts around some of those policies, maybe that either got included or are still pending. Chris Cooper, sorry.
I guess still pending is more on my mind.
Okay.
The Republican Study Committee, which is the largest block of House Republicans, unveiled a package that they're calling the Making the American Dream Affordable Again framework last month, which is meant to be a reconciliation 2.0. So when we've been talking about OB3, the one big beautiful bill that Republicans did last year, that was reconciliation, meaning they were able to do it with just Republican votes. And you can only do that once a year. And so these Republicans, study committee Republicans, they've put together a framework that they'd like to act on um, this year under reconciliation. And some of the provisions within that are um, tax issues. One of them, they're looking to end what they call the child independent care tax credit marriage penalty by eliminating the requirement that both parents work in order to be eligible. So trying to support stay-at-home parents. A popular Republican push has been repealing the death tax. That's in there. So there's different tax provisions within reconciliation, but um, from my perspective, it's highly unlikely that they'll be able to move forward on this proposal, given the dynamics that we've been talking about during this whole call of, members coming at this from different perspectives, different district makeups, and different vulnerabilities heading into the election later this year. So this framework is out there. It has a number of tax provisions within it, but I don't think that we'll see a whole lot of movement this year at least on trying to move it through the chamber.
Yeah, complete agreement. That was great.
All right. We can move right on. Okay, so I do see some questions coming in here. So we'll shift to these questions. If you all have others, just post them here. Can Congress do a revision of those funds for ICE?
Yeah. So yes, Congress can, but it would likely require Democrats controlling both chambers of Congress and the White House. So not likely for the rest of the Trump presidency, and depending on the dynamics beyond. So that's what you've seen happen since Republicans took control of all three. They repealed a number of provisions that were in the reconciliation packages that were passed under Joe Biden and when Democrats controlled Congress. So yes, theoretically, if Democrats take over all three, they could repeal certain provisions from the package. It's more, I believe that the ICE funding was only for like 4-ish years. So I don't know how likely it is that that particular aspect gets impacted, but some of the other items within One Big Beautiful Bill Act, you talked about the Medicaid changes, like things like that, they could certainly try to adjust if they have control.
Yeah, I mean, if Democrats have a trifecta in 2029, I have a feeling that not only will ICE those funds be removed, but I think there's going to be a reorganization of immigration enforcement overall. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was actually, if the filibuster were killed, then an immigration law would go through, reform law like the one that Marco Rubio supported in 2013, that George W. Bush supported in 2006 or 7. I have a feeling that will go along with that. So I think that immigration, maybe it's just recency bias that it's all happening now, but I have a feeling that's the sort of thing that would be non-negotiable for any Democratic president to get through Congress relatively quickly. And that would be kind of the Obamacare of 2029. That would be the one where you say, we've tried to do this for decades and we finally did it. So it would be part of, I think, a broader strategy if that happened.
Yeah, I do think if a Democrat wins the White House next time and there's Democrat led House and Senate, that would be the time to finally do this immigration reform.
Challenge
So
is they can't do it under reconciliation. They'd have to get rid of the filibuster, which if they do that, I mean, I'm opposed to it. Either party, all hell will break loose. Whenever the parties control change, I mean, you're going to see. If we think there's drastic change right now in policy with administration changes, if they do that, it's going to be a
I agree.
hundredfold.
I don't think they'll do
So
it, Chris. I think that they'll come up because, like Senator Lee had stepped forward, there are Republicans, especially in the Senate, who have been trying to do some kind of immigration reform. But I just think under this administration, it won't have. It would have to be like a new, fresh
yeah,
administration. That's
for
what I was
sure.
saying.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but I totally agree, and I would hope they would not end filibuster because that would destroy the institution completely. So, and I think they're scared enough to not do that.
I disagree. I want them to destroy the
Oh, you
filibuster.
do? Oh,
I also want the Senate to be destroyed because it is the least representative institution, democratic legislative body in the entire world. But I don't know if that's going to happen. But I do think there will be at least a carve out of the filibuster for certain things. So I think there would be a Roe v. Wade carve out. There would be an immigration carve out. There
It's
might
gone,
be.
man. It's dead.
I
It's
mean, it's
gone.
effectively dead, but they wouldn't say we're killing the filibuster. They'll say we're doing this and that. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how they can run saying we're going to do it and then get there and say, whoops, we can't because the filibuster exists. I think it's one of those things that will be the litmus test of any Senate candidate and any presidential candidate in 2028. I say this because you're already seeing it with Janet Mills in Maine. She said that she was in favor of keeping the judicial filibuster, which doesn't actually exist anymore. And Graham
yeah.
Plattner's campaign jumped right on that and said, you can't send someone to Washington. And she kind of walked it back. But I have a feeling it's the sort of thing that it is on its way out, regardless of who wins.
Wow. I disagree. I disagree. I think
I
it
do
will
too. I think
stay.
you're going to have a challenge with some of the, again,
Yeah.
I don't want to call them moderate, but some of the folks in the Democrat Party, like a Fetterman, that might not want to go as far as removing it. But we'll see. I think
Yeah.
it would be terrible. I think then you go from swings of uh, completely going back on Roe v. Wade to even stronger Republican policy position on it if they take over again. So things like that. I mean, if you think swings are pretty wild right now, it's going to be unbelievable if that happens. So
Yeah. Well, I think if people vote to change parties, they vote to change parties. But anyway, I also think we should
Right.
have prime minister's questions in Congress. So
Okay.
I may
All
have some
right.
different ideas.
Interesting discussion.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have a few more questions here. I think we talked about SBIR's the authorization in a lot of detail. Is it if drastically changed, discuss ramifications on current grantees? Okay. So I think in the end, everyone knows we need this program. It is a hugely successful program that ensures we have innovation in this country, makes us globally competitive, businesses benefit. So I do think they'll get this deal done if to have 5 or 6 of them all on this, same page. I think we're going to get there. And then that means that the funds can start to come out again. They'll have the announcements, people can submit and they can get funded again. So I think that's what's going to happen. The main difference is that, those companies that just live off of SBI, they call them SBIR chains, they just
yeah,
keep going
yeah.
after SBIR. That's going to end. So you're no longer going to have a business that solely focuses with the only revenue source being SBIRs. I think that is something that's definitely going to change. I don't know if any of you guys want to jump in on that, but I can move on to some other questions.
I'll just say that Senator Markey has a competitive reelection right now, so contact his office. I think he is open to pressure because he's in a very difficult fight for reelection, and this is the sort of thing that I would expect him to pass and then champion in a bunch of press releases. So I do think it's going to happen. I do think he will pass it, but you can always contact his office to try to pressure him more.
Yeah. Okay, what about changing topics? The increase of requirements for identification for voting, I guess like the SAVE Act that passed the House. What thoughts do we have around elections and requirements to register to vote and vote?
I mean, I personally think that it's a good proposal. It basically would require proving citizenship through a variety of documents like a birth certificate, passport, to register to vote in federal elections, and then photo ID to vote. I know polling was very overwhelmingly supportive, particularly on the showing government issued ID to vote. I think a majority of both parties, when Pew polled that last year, were supportive of that. It's not going to happen this cycle. It did pass the bill, again, called the um, SAVE Act, did pass in the House recently, but in the Senate, again, getting back to the filibuster, this would be an example where if the filibuster was gone, this would be signed into law because there are now 50 Republicans in the Senate that have signed on to support this, the latest being Susan Collins from Maine. But as it currently stands, this is subject to the filibuster in the Senate. You need 60 votes. No Democrats are going to be supporting this in the Senate, so it's effectively dead. Have changed their last name. It's a poll tax. I see in the chat. So I know that there is concern about um, individuals that have changed their name through marriage. The bill does call on the Bipartisan Election Assistance Commission to establish guidelines for states to accept supplementary documents. So there's things like marriage licenses that could prove citizenship when the birth certificate and current name don't match. So they are contemplating that that could be an issue that arises within the legislation if it passes. So I don't necessarily agree to that. So that's my thoughts. But yeah, it's effectively dead in the Senate.
It is dead. I think to me the interesting thing here is how partisan kind of ideology can last longer than changes in actual net benefit. Because I saw a study that said if this passed, it would actually hurt Republicans more than it would Democrats. Given how the coalitions have changed over the last 10 years. And so I think it's just an interesting little data point about how in DC the thought of requiring for voting helps Republicans, which I remember growing up was always the assumption, probably has shifted, and yet this is still the docket. So yeah, that's my take is that it is interesting that you'll see things happen. You're like, that's kind of odd because it probably wouldn't help that party. But I think if you're in Congress working every day, you've always thought this for like 10, 20 years, that like this is our position. It's hard to give that up.
Yeah, it is interesting. The whole thing is some chats going on about 50% of people don't even have passports in this country. And if you do change your name, then that's the concern I think that a lot of people are concerned about, as well as some other things. But it's not going to happen, as Chris said, due to filibuster. It will not happen. So that's that. All right. So in our final minute, are there any election or campaigns that you want to highlight, some interesting races that are happening in the country that might really shape things with the midterm elections? Would love to hear from each of you, like real quick. 30 seconds each. Go.
I'll start. Texas Senate is really interesting because both primaries matter. If it is Tallarico versus Paxton, I think it is a toss-up. If it is Abbott versus Crockett, I think it is a lean Republican. So I think the primaries really matter, and I believe early voting is about to start this week or next week. So we might have a much more competitive Texas race or less competitive within just a month or so.
That was the one I was going to mention. The other one was the Louisiana Senate race that I mentioned earlier, the Trump-backed candidate versus the incumbent that has stuck his neck out, both, again, voting to impeach him previously, but then also calling into question some of the decisions and policies that RFK has been putting into place at HHS. He has, as a physician, highlighted that those are not necessarily science-backed and not good policies. And so seeing how he fares in his primary election against the Trump-backed candidate is what I'll be looking at.
Yeah, agree to those. And then also Maine, to have the chair of the Appropriations Committee have the toughest re-election she's ever faced is also going to be really interesting. And she's always tried to kind of hedge and be this moderate Republican for that state. But to run up against a governor is really, really going to be tough for her. So it'll be really interesting. So with that, it's a wrap. Thank you all for dialing in for our quarterly series, What's Happening in Washington, D.C. We will send out the recording and stay tuned for our next quarterly call. Thanks so much. Bye.
Yeah.